In a quiet study in Switzerland, 1939, Carl Jung wrote something that would challenge everything we think about who we are. After decades of treating patients and exploring the depths of human consciousness, he encountered an ancient truth that seemed impossible. A 2,500-year-old teaching of the Buddha that suggested the self he spent his life studying might not exist at all. Yet Jung wasn't deterred. Instead, he wrote, "Buddhism is the cleanest, most sensible, and most direct of all religions." What did this giant of Western psychology see in Buddha's teachings? And more importantly, what happens when these two profound perspectives on human consciousness collide? The tension between these ideas holds the key to unlocking a deeper truth about who we are and who we are not. Hello, I'm Peter from Buddha's Wisdom. Before we explore this profound paradox, let's set the stage. Picture two moments in history. First, beneath the Bodhi tree in ancient India, where Siddhartha Gautama realizes the truth of no self, that our sense of a permanent, unchanging self is an illusion. This radical insight would become one of Buddhism's core teachings. Now fast forward to the early 20th century. Carl Jung, already famous for his work on the human psyche, sits in his study surrounded by Eastern texts. He's developing his theory of the self as the center of psychological wholeness, seemingly the exact opposite of Buddha's teaching. These two perspectives shaped how millions understand themselves, but here's what makes this truly fascinating. Both ideas work. Both have helped countless people find peace and healing. Both are supported by modern research. How is this possible? We'll see how Jung and Buddha developed their revolutionary insights, their true meaning of self and no self, and the surprising ways these ideas complement each other. More than mere philosophy, this understanding holds practical power to transform your daily life. Let's turn back the clock to understand the historical context that shaped these revolutionary ideas. Our story begins in the vibrant streets of 19th century Germany, where a young philosopher named Arthur Schopenhauer first introduced Buddhist ideas to Western intellectual circles. His work would later captivate a young Carl Jung, opening his eyes to Eastern wisdom. Jung wrote in his memoirs, "Schopenhauer was the first to speak of the suffering of the world, which visibly and glaringly surrounds us, and of confusion, passion, evil." This connection deepened in 1909 when Jung encountered Richard Wilhelm, the renowned Chinese classics translator. Through their friendship, Jung gained unprecedented access to Eastern philosophical texts, marking a turning point in his understanding of the psyche. This meeting marked a turning point for Jung. From 1909 to 1914, he immersed himself in Eastern texts, spending 3 hours each morning studying Sanskrit. His letters from this period reveal an increasing fascination with Buddhist concepts, particularly their parallels with his patients' experiences. By 1920, Jung had accumulated one of Europe's most comprehensive private collections of Buddhist texts, including rare Tibetan manuscripts. 25 centuries earlier, in the flourishing Gangetic plain of ancient India, a different revelation unfolded. Prince Siddhartha Gautama, after years of searching, discovered a profound truth under the Bodhi tree. His insight into no self wasn't merely philosophical. It stemmed from direct experience. In the Anatta Lakkhana Sutta, he proclaimed, "Form, monks, is not self. If form were self, then form would not lead to affliction." This pivotal moment occurred around 485 BCE, when the 35-year-old Siddhartha attained enlightenment. Within weeks, he delivered the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta at Sarnath, establishing the foundation of Buddhist thought. 5 years later, his teaching of anatta emerged fully formed in the Anatta Lakkhana Sutta at Varanasi. The cultural exchange between East and West accelerated dramatically during Jung's lifetime. As steamships and telegraphs connected continents, Buddhist texts reached Europe in unprecedented numbers. Jung's personal library in Küsnacht, filled with Sanskrit and Pali translations, Eastern commentaries, and philosophical treatises. But Jung wasn't just a passive reader. His analytical psychology emerged during a time of profound global change. While treating patients in his Swiss practice, he noticed patterns that eerily matched Buddhist descriptions of consciousness. In his clinical notes from 1925, he observed, "The parallels between these psychological insights and the teachings of Buddha are remarkable, yet they emerged independently from my Western medical practice." This convergence wasn't coincidental. Both Jung and Buddha confronted fundamental questions about human suffering and its roots in our sense of self. Their methods differed, Jung through psychoanalysis, Buddha through meditation. But their investigations led to complementary insights about consciousness. Even more fascinating is how Jung's personal crisis, documented in his Red Book, mirrored Buddha's period of intense questioning. Both men emerged from their ordeals with revolutionary understanding. Jung reflected, "I had to accept that what I had previously called myself was a complex interplay of factors, much like what Buddha described centuries ago. Yet their cultural contexts shaped how they expressed these insights. While Buddha taught in the language of Dharma and dependent origination, Jung spoke of archetypes and the collective unconscious. These different vocabularies sometimes mask their shared understanding. What exactly did Jung mean by the self? In his groundbreaking work Aion, published in 1951, Jung presents the self as something far more profound than our everyday personality. He writes, "The self is not only the center, but also the whole circumference which embraces both conscious and unconscious. It is the center of this totality, just as the ego is the center of consciousness." For Jung, the ego, our conscious identity, is merely the tip of an immense psychological iceberg. Through his work with patients, he discovered that beneath our conscious awareness lies a vast reservoir of psychological material. This wasn't just personal memories or repressed thoughts. Jung found evidence of universal patterns he called archetypes, shared across cultures and time periods. In his personal journals, Jung documented numerous cases where patients with no knowledge of Eastern spirituality spontaneously produced mandalas, circular symbols that he recognized as representations of the self. One particularly striking case involved a businessman who dreamed of a luminous crystal at the bottom of a deep well. Jung noted, "Without any knowledge of Eastern thought, my patient had discovered the symbol of the self that Buddhist texts describe as the diamond body." But Jung's concept of self wasn't static. In Psychology and Alchemy, he describes it as a process rather than a fixed entity. The self is not a static entity but a dynamic process of wholeness. This process, which he called individuation, involves integrating unconscious aspects of the psyche into consciousness. Through clinical observation, Jung identified distinct stages in this journey toward wholeness. Patients first encountered their shadow, the rejected aspects of themselves. Then came the anima, or animus, their inner feminine or masculine counterparts. Finally, they experienced what Jung termed self-realization, a state remarkably similar to Buddhist enlightenment. Jung supported his theories with extensive research into mythology, religion, and alchemy. In his clinical files, he recorded thousands of dreams and visions that pointed to universal patterns in the human psyche. One patient's dream of a radiant center surrounded by darkness paralleled ancient Tibetan mandalas, despite the patient having no exposure to Buddhist imagery. The self in Jung's psychology serves as both origin and destination. As he wrote in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, the self might equally well be called the God within us. Yet this divine center paradoxically contains all opposites: conscious and unconscious, good and evil, spirit and matter. Jung's late writings reveal an increasingly nuanced view of the self, one that began to bridge the gap with Buddhist thought. In his foreword to D.T. Suzuki's work, he acknowledges, "The more we understand the self, the more we realize its profound emptiness." The Buddha's teaching of anatta, or no self, stands as one of the most radical propositions in human thought. In the Anatthalakkhana Sutta, his second discourse after enlightenment, Buddha challenged the prevailing notion of an unchanging soul, or self. Form is not self. Feeling is not self. Perception is not self. Mental formations are not self. Consciousness is not self. Modern Buddhist scholar Bhikkhu Bodhi explains, the anatta doctrine is not a mere philosophical opinion, but a strategy for seeing through the conceit of self, and thereby letting go of all attachment. This interpretation aligns with both classical commentaries and contemporary understanding of the teaching. To understand this profound teaching, we must first grasp what Buddha meant by self. In ancient India, the dominant Vedic tradition taught the existence of an eternal, unchanging soul called Atman. Buddha's direct experience through meditation revealed something different: a dynamic flow of experience with no permanent center. The Buddha used a practical method to demonstrate this truth. He broke down human experience into 5 aggregates, or skandhas: form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. Through systematic examination, he showed that none of these components, alone or combined, constitutes a permanent self. Consider a simple example Buddha often used: a chariot. When we disassemble a chariot into its wheels, axle, body, and reins, where is the chariotness? It exists only as a convenient label for these parts working together. Similarly, our sense of self is a useful convention, but under scrutiny, we find only changing processes. In the Milindapanya, an ancient Buddhist text, we find a fascinating dialogue between the monk Nagasena and King Milinda. When the king asks Nagasena his name, the monk responds, "Nagasena is just a designation, a term, a concept, a name. No permanent person exists here." This perfectly captures Buddha's teaching on no self. The Visuddhimagga, a cornerstone of Buddhist philosophy, presents another compelling perspective through the metaphor of a lighting lamp. Each flame appears continuous, yet is never the same from moment to moment. The text states, "The being of the present moment lives but does not proceed to the next moment." This illustrates how our apparent continuity of self exists without requiring a permanent essence. The subtlety of this teaching becomes clear in the Buddha's careful language. He never claimed, "There is no self." Such a statement would simply replace one fixed view with another. Instead, he demonstrated that what we take to be a self cannot be found when we look deeply. As recorded in the Samyutta Nikaya, when one sees with wisdom that all phenomena are not self, then one grows weary of suffering. This is the path to purification. This understanding transforms our relationship with experience. The Dhammapada captures this shift. All conditioned things are impermanent. When one sees this with wisdom, one turns away from suffering. Rather than creating despair, this insight liberates us from the exhausting task of maintaining a fixed identity. The practice of seeing no self appears throughout Buddhist traditions. Zen masters ask, "What was your original face before your parents were born?" Tibetan practitioners contemplate the question, "Who is it that thinks?" These inquiries point directly to the experience beyond our conceptual understanding of self. Yet Buddha emphasized that this teaching serves a practical purpose, the end of suffering. Understanding no self naturally dissolves our tendency to grasp and reject experience based on a fictional fixed identity. What remains is the natural flow of phenomena, undistorted by the illusion of a permanent self. This insight carries profound implications. By seeing through the illusion of a fixed self, we naturally develop compassion for all beings who share this fundamental condition. The teaching doesn't negate conventional identity, but reveals its constructed nature, allowing us to engage with life more freely and authentically. At first glance, Jung's concept of the self and Buddha's teaching of no self appear irreconcilable, yet a deeper examination reveals surprising convergence. In his later writings, Jung himself hinted at this connection. The self as a unifying principle within the human psyche occupies the center of potential wholeness. At its core, it's both everything and nothing, just as the Buddhists maintain. This apparent paradox resolves when we understand both perspectives more deeply. Jung's clinical work revealed that the more his patients approached self-realization, the more their rigid ego structures dissolved. In his Personal Notes from 1938, he observed, "The experience of the self brings a dissolution of the identity we've always taken for granted." Here we find the clearest convergence between Jung and Buddha, Jung's self-realization and Buddha's liberation. Both point to transcending the ego's limitations. While their languages differ, both discovered that freedom comes through releasing rigid self-concepts, not strengthening them. What unites these perspectives is their shared recognition of the ego as both necessary and illusory. Jung believed that the ego serves as a gateway to greater wholeness, just as Buddha acknowledged that conventional identity is a useful tool for navigating daily life. Yet both traditions ultimately guide us beyond this limited sense of self, revealing a deeper reality that transcends individuality. The Tibetan Book of the Dead particularly fascinated Jung, who wrote extensive commentary on its psychological significance. He noted how its description of consciousness dissolving into clear light paralleled his patients' experiences of ego dissolution during profound psychological transformation. What Buddhism calls emptiness, he wrote, we might call the ultimate ground of psychic reality. A revealing example comes from Jung's own practice. During his confrontation with the unconscious, documented in the Red Book, Jung experienced states remarkably similar to Buddhist descriptions of emptiness. He describes moments where his usual sense of self completely dissolved, revealing what he called the pleroma, a state beyond all distinctions. Both traditions recognize that our usual sense of self causes suffering. While Buddhism directly points to the illusion of self, Jung's approach guides people through the psychological structures that maintain this illusion. As he noted in a 1939 seminar, individuation leads to a paradoxical result. The more one becomes oneself, the more one realizes the universal quality of being. The role of suffering also bridges their teachings. For Buddha, suffering arises from clinging to impermanent phenomena, including the self. Jung similarly observed that psychological distress often stems from an inability to integrate the unconscious, leading to fragmented identities. Both approaches emphasize a path of transformation, Buddha through the Eightfold Path, and Jung through individuation, that resolves this inner tension and fosters a deeper harmony. Jung's concept of archetypes offers another bridge. These universal patterns exist independent of any individual ego, suggesting a reality beyond personal identity. Similarly, Buddhist teachings speak of Dharma, the underlying patterns of reality that exist whether or not we recognize them. The therapeutic practices of both traditions often align in surprising ways. Jung's active imagination parallels certain Buddhist visualization practices. Both methods aim to loosen rigid ego structures and allow deeper wisdom to emerge. As Jung wrote after studying Buddhist texts, "The East has taught me another, wider, more profound, and higher understanding through life." This convergence becomes particularly clear in their shared emphasis on direct experience. Both Buddha and Jung insisted that intellectual understanding alone cannot transform consciousness. Jung stated, "The patient must experience something that grips him, then he can learn to overcome his former attitudes." In the end, both Jung and Buddha teach that transformation begins by facing ourselves, not as static entities, but as fluid processes. Through direct experience, in meditation, analysis, or daily reflection, we discover that freedom lies in embracing the paradox of selfhood. It is both everything and nothing, an illusion and a gateway to wholeness. The synthesis of Jung's psychology and Buddhist wisdom offers profound tools for personal transformation. A vivid example appears in contemporary therapeutic practices, where clinicians integrate both perspectives. One therapist documented a patient's breakthrough. When Sarah stopped trying to fix herself and began to observe its fluid nature, her anxiety decreased dramatically. She discovered what Jung called the self and Buddha pointed to as no self, not by seeking, but by letting go. This integration manifests in concrete practices. Take dream work, for instance. Jung's approach to dreams encourages us to engage with dream figures as aspects of our psyche. When combined with Buddhist mindfulness, this practice becomes even more powerful. Rather than identifying with or rejecting dream experiences, we learn to observe them with spacious awareness. Contemplative psychotherapy demonstrates another practical application. Here, Jung's understanding of the shadow meets Buddhist techniques for working with difficult emotions. Patients learn to welcome all aspects of their experience without identifying with them. One psychiatrist noted, "When we stop fighting against parts of ourselves, integration happens naturally." The practice of active imagination, central to Jungian psychology, takes on new depth when paired with Buddhist insights. Instead of seeking a stronger self, practitioners learn to move fluidly between different aspects of psyche. A long-term meditator described this experience. "I used to think I needed to become someone better. Now I see there's no fixed self to improve, just an unfolding process to trust." This combined approach particularly helps with chronic identity struggles. Jung's map of psychological development, enriched by Buddhist wisdom, shows how our suffering often stems from rigid self-concepts. One case study describes a businessman who transformed his workaholism. Understanding both perspectives helped him see his drive for success as neither self nor not self, but as a pattern he could relate to more wisely. Even relationships benefit from this integrated understanding. When we grasp neither at permanent selfhood nor deny our relative existence, we can engage more authentically with others. A couples therapist reported, "Partners who understand both Jung's and Buddha's insights fight less about who's right and connect more deeply with each other's essential nature." Beyond individual transformation and relationships, these insights have found their way into broader social contexts. In organizational settings, this synthesis has borne fruit. Leadership programs incorporating both perspectives help executives navigate power without becoming inflated or depleted. As one CEO reflected, "Understanding the self as both center and no center paradoxically made me both more effective and more humble." Therapists and practitioners keep finding fresh ways to blend these approaches. The key lies not in choosing between Jung and Buddha, but in allowing both perspectives to illuminate our path toward wholeness. What began as a seeming contradiction between Jung's integrated self and Buddha's no self reveals itself as a profound complementarity. Their wisdom, separated by millennia, yet united in purpose, offers us a richer understanding of human consciousness and the path to psychological freedom. Jung wrote near the end of his life, "The goal of Eastern religious practice is the same as that of Western psychology, the shifting of the center of gravity from the ego to the self." Buddha expressed this same truth through different words. Like a water bubble, like a mirage, one who regards the world in this way, death does not find. Both remind us that our suffering stems not from having or lacking a self, but from how we relate to our experience. By loosening our grip on fixed identity, we can embrace life with greater wisdom and compassion. Jung called this wholeness, Buddha termed it liberation. Both paths lead to the same universal truth. Freedom lies in seeing beyond the illusion of separation. Like the two wings of a bird, Jung's depth psychology and Buddha's teachings work together, showing us that our struggles with identity can become gateways to profound wisdom. Now I leave you with a question to reflect on. What lies beyond the story you tell yourself about who you are? Share your thoughts in the comments below. What resonated with you? What challenged you? Your perspective enriches this conversation. And if you haven't already, join our journey by subscribing. Together, we'll continue exploring the profound questions that shape our lives. Until next time, may your journey be filled with clarity, courage, and compassion. See you in the next video.